In this video, we'll delve into Magnus Carlsen's mastery of the London system by analyzing 3 games that highlight his innovative strategies in the opening. The first opponent is the world champion Ding Liren. Magnus starts d4 and black replies knight f6. White develops the knight to f3 and black pushes d5, fighting back for the center. Then white's bishop f4 marks the beginning of the London system, where white will often follow with moves like e3, c3, knight b to d2, and putting the other bishop on d3. This setup can be used against almost any black defense, so it has a smaller set of opening theory. Black launches his c-pawn, trying to exchange a flank pawn for a central pawn. White pushes e3, opening up his kingside bishop, and black does the same with e6. Magnus plays c3, creating a stronghold at the d4 square. Black's bishop d6 challenges white's bishop while preparing to castle. White develops his knight from b to d2, not worrying about black capturing his bishop, because although his pawns would get doubled, he would gain a firm grip over the e5 square, which would be a great outpost for his knight. So black captures the pawn on d4, and with the situation in the center clarifying, white captures the bishop on d6, realizing that after the queen would recapture and he would take back the pawn on d4, his light squared bishop would be better than black's light squared bishop, who has to play around all of his pawns on light squares. But black does not recapture the bishop, instead taking the pawn on e3 with a counterattack on the knight. Magnus boldly drops his bishop back to a3 before black regains the piece, capturing the knight on d2, and white takes back the pawn with his queen. What has happened is that white has sacrificed the pawn, but in return has gained a potent bishop, aiming down the diagonal where it steals away black's right to castle. White will build up an attack, while black will try to convert his material advantage. Black develops his knight to c6, and white's queen jumps to g5, attacking the undefended g7 pawn. Since black cannot castle kingside anyways, he shifts his rook to g8, protecting the pawn. Then white moves his bishop to d3, pressuring the slightly weakened h7 pawn. So black pushes the pawn to h6, hitting the queen, and she retreats to e3, before black's queen dashes to b6, offering an exchange. Magnus keeps the queens on the board, dropping his to e2. After black develops the bishop to d7, white castles kingside, and black castles queenside. With opposite sides castling, the stage is set for a heated battle. White immediately launches his b-pawn, looking to break down white's queenside. Now black should fight back with a move like e5, threatening a fork on e4. Instead, he plays too passively with king b8, getting his king off the semi-open file. This allows white to press on without fear, as b5 hits the enemy knight. The knight moves to a5, losing defense of the e5 square. Magnus exploits this, with knight e5 centralizing his knight and attacking the f7 pawn. Black's bishop drops to e8, where it can defend. Then white moves his bishop to b4, defending his loose pawn and tying the black queen down to the defense of the knight on a5. Black shifts his rook to the open c-file, and white pushes a4, fastening his advanced b-pawn into place. At this point, it's difficult for black to find the move, as his pieces are somewhat uncoordinated and out of place, while white's pieces are incredibly active. Black decides to give back the sacrificed pawn with knight e4, aiming to simplify the position. White takes the knight, black recaptures, and white takes the offered pawn, equalizing material. Then black plays f6, trying to kick away white's almighty knight. Magnus ignores the attack as his queen swoops to h7, hitting the rook. Black could move his bishop to connect the rooks, but the bishop has to keep a watchful eye on the d7 square where the knight could jump in with a royal fork. Black instead inserts knight b3, hitting white's rook. White takes the rook on g8, and black captures white's rook on a1. Now black's idea is that both knights are hanging, so either both are captured or both retreat. But white has something else in mind. Magnus spectacularly sacrifices his queen by capturing the bishop on e8, and black is impelled to resign. This move removes the defense of the d7 square, so black would not have time to recapture the queen without hanging the royal fork with knight d7, all while his knight on a1 is still hanging. Black's best option would be taking the knight, after which white would move his queen to e7 and black would save his knight from the corner. Then white would play bishop d6, forking the king and then winning the pawn on e5. What would be left is an endgame where white is up a pawn and soon to win more with the weak pawns on the black king side. Meanwhile, black's knight would still have trouble escaping from hostile enemy territory. And black knows he wouldn't be able to hold on to this position against someone as strong as Magnus. Magnus's victory in this one highlights the London system's strategic richness and shows just how well it can handle complex situations. The next opponent is Grandmaster Ehsan Maghami, and as the opening carries on, white routinely plays the moves characteristic of the London system. After black's bishop d6 challenging white's bishop, white retreats it to g3 so that were black to capture it, he would get the open h-file for his rook. Black instead pushes his pawn to c5, challenging white's center, and white solidifies it with c3. Black develops the knight to c6, and white jumps his knight from b to d2. Black now decides to capture the bishop on g3, and white recaptures, claiming the open h-file. Then black advances his queen to d6, taking the place of the bishop and signaling a potential queenside castle. Magnus continues bishop b5, pinning the knight to the king and undermining black's control of the e5 square. After black breaks the pin with bishop d7, white captures the knight. Black recaptures before white hops his knight onto a powerful post on e5. This stops black from castling queenside as it would hang the f7 pawn. So black drops his queen to c7, defending the pawn. White moves his queen to f3, indirectly adding pressure to the f7 point, and black plays h6, weakening the white rook's impact down the h-file. White's queen f4 defends his knight so that he now threatens to take the c5 pawn without hanging the knight. In light of this, black slides his queen to e7, defending the c-pawn. Magnus presses forward with g4, aiming to play g5, which would exploit the pin on the pawn to the rook and force the enemy knight backwards. In response, black moves his knight to h7, covering the g5 square and looking to potentially jump forward. White drops his queen to g3, making way for the f-pawn to advance. After black plays rook g8, losing his right to castle, white decides to hold back on his pawn storm and then castle kingside instead. Black reactivates his knight onto f6, and white slides his rook to c1 to support a c-pawn break. Black, in anticipation that the c-file will soon open up, also moves his rook to c8, losing the right to castle both sides. Magnus pushes c4 to break open the center, and black captures the pawn. White takes on c5, luring the black queen to c5 after she recaptures. Then white takes the pawn on c4, opening the c-file along with an indirect attack on the black queen. Things are starting to look dangerous for black. The threat is to capture on f7, then play knight c to d6 defended by the knight, opening a discovered attack on the queen. And black wouldn't be able to take the knight on f7 because then knight e5 check would open a discovered attack on the queen as well. So black moves the king to e7, getting out of any checks. Then white pushes b4, sacrificing the pawn, and black takes it with the queen, who as a result loses her influence over the center. Magnus drops his knight back to d3, attacking the enemy queen and threatening to jump in with queen d6. And with the black queen lured to b4, she just cannot retreat anywhere to defend against queen d6. So black counterattacks white's queen with knight e4. This leads to an exchange of queens as white takes on b4 and black takes on g3. White recaptures, getting the fabled tripled pawns. And white is up a piece, but black has the move bishop b5, opening up his rook's attack on the knight and pinning the knight to the rook. Now white could try defending with rook f4, but then the knight would be pinned to the undefended rook behind it. And after black moves his other rook to the open d-file, there wouldn't be a good way to stop the threat of a5, which would trap the other knight. And we note that the knight can't move to c2 because it would hang the knight as it interferes with the rook's defense of it. Back to the game. The position would be pretty much equal here if not for one move. Can you find how white wins? The move Magnus plays is rook takes f7 check. This gets out of the pin, and if the king moves to the d file, then the other rook could also get out of the pin with check, and white would just be up a full piece. Moving the king to e8 would lead to the same result as what happens in the game. After black takes the rook on f7, he walks right into a fork with knight d6. Black moves the king to e7, and white takes the rook with check, defended by his own rook, emerging up a full piece. Black shifts his king to d7. White takes the pawn on a7, attacking the bishop, who moves to a4, trying to trap white's knight and win it. But after white's knight to d3, black resigns. The threat is knight c5, forking the bishop and the king. And were black to play b6 to try to stop that, white would play knight e5 check, followed by knight a to c6, escaping his knight from any trap. In this game, Magnus demonstrates not only the potency of the London system, but its potential for tactical opportunities. The final opponent is the young American Grandmaster Jeffrey Xiong. Magnus starts d4 and black replies knight f6. In this one, white puts his knight on c3 to gain a foothold over the queenside. Black pushes d5 and white brings his bishop to f4. Black continues e6 and white replies e3 before black swoops his bishop to b4, pinning the knight to the king. White defends it, moving his other knight from g to e2, and black castles. Then white pushes a3, asking the question to black's bishop, who retreats all the way to e7. Magnus carries on with an interesting maneuver of knight g1. This opens his bishop and looks to reroute the knight to a more active square now that his other knight is no longer under attack. Black pushes c5, challenging white's center, and white redevelops his knight onto f3. Then black hunts down white's bishop with knight h5. White ignores this, deciding to capture the pawn on c5. Black captures the bishop and white recaptures before black takes back the pawn on c5 with his bishop. What's happened is white now has a slight lead in development, and his f-pawn supports his knight if it were ever to jump forward. White develops his bishop to d3, directed at the king side. Black plays g6 to blunt the diagonal, but this gives white a point to bite onto. He immediately pushes h4, looking to break open the black king side. And black should probably play h5, but white might eventually push g4 in response. So black continues development with knight c6. Magnus presses on with h5, and black's queen jumps to f6 to support his king in this ordeal, while also attacking the f4 pawn. White replies queen d2, defending his pawn and preparing to castle queenside. Then black pushes e5, wanting to open up the center as soon as possible with white's king still there. But this move is where he goes wrong. The d-pawn is now hanging, and white takes it, getting a powerful centralized knight who attacks the black queen. The queen slides over to d6, counterattacking the knight, so white moves his bishop to c4, defending it. Black attempts to deflect the bishop with b5, but white calmly retreats it to a2, where it keeps its sights on the enemy king along the diagonal. Black finally wins back the pawn by capturing on f4. Magnus castles his king queenside in the nick of time, just as the center opened up, while taking full advantage of the open d-file with his rook. Black pushes b4 to build up an attack of his own, but we shouldn't forget about white's h-pawn. White captures on g6, and black should not recapture with the f-pawn because of white's sniper bishop, nor should he allow white to take a second pawn. So black captures with the h-pawn, opening the h-file for the white rook. White's knight leaps forward to g5 with dire intentions. Black develops his final minor piece with bishop f5, but it's just too little too late. Magnus's knight hops to h7, attacking the rook, who evades it, sliding over to d8. Then white moves the knight from h to f6 with check. The king sidesteps to f8 before the rook swoops down the h-file, giving check on h8. The black king moves to its only available square on g7, opening the rooks to one another. White checks with rook h7, forcing the king back to f8, before sliding his other rook over to the h-file, inducing a black resignation. The threat is rook h8 check, followed by king g7, and rook 1 to h7 checkmate. The only way to stop this would be g5 opening the bishop up to the h7 square. But then white would still play rook h8 check, and after king g7, he would play rook 1 to h7 anyways. Black would capture the rook, and white would recapture, forcing the king back to f8, after which white would play queen d3. Rook h8 followed by queen h7 would be checkmate. And this would be unstoppable unless black decides to give away a boatload of material, capturing the knight on f6. White would recapture, and we notice that black cannot even take the queen because rook takes f7 would be checkmate. Magnus Carlsen's brilliant execution of the London system in this game uncovers its hidden attacking potential, turning a traditionally solid opening into a powerful offensive tool. I hope these games were both entertaining and instructive. Don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe for more chess content.